Welcome back to Combat Mission Shock Force 2, where we're taking the Canadians out for a spin. The Canadians come with a NATO module, and while they have some interesting looking scenarios, none of them really pushed my buttons. Luckily, Combat Mission comes with a mission editor, and after finding a scenario featuring the German army that I like the look of, I simply opened it up in the editor, swapped the existing German force with equivalent Canadian units, made sure that the new units were factored into the objectives, and then got stuck in. One of the great things about Combat Mission is that thanks to the editor you have the flexibility to adjust existing scenarios or quick battle maps to suit your preferences if that's what you want to do. I also repicked the original German units and their Canadian replacements in the quick battle force selector to get a rough handle on whether or not I was affecting the balance of the scenario. The German force came to about 9,500 points and the Canadians came to 7,800, so the changes I've made are actually likely to have increased the difficulty, at least on paper. The original German force has more combat power than the Canadians I'm going to be playing with here. And this should hopefully give the Syrian army, who's going to be on the receiving end, a bit more of a chance. At this stage in the war, NATO forces coming down from the Turkish border are moving to surround the city of Aleppo. Local air operations have been disrupted by heavy anti-air fire from this area, and our battle group has been tasked with going forward and destroying Shilka self-propelled AA vehicles that intelligence thinks are in the vicinity. This sounds easy enough. I have a significant force at my disposal. To kick things off, I've got a platoon of Leopard 2 tanks and 2 platoons of infantry in LAVs, along with some recce units, 155mm artillery and 81mm mortar support, which alone should be enough to deal with pretty much anything the projective enemy force of militia infantry and AA vehicles should be able to throw at me, without taking into consideration the fact that I'm set to be reinforced by another infantry platoon and a platoon of pioneers. The tricky part of this scenario though comes with some of my other objectives. Firstly, because this is an inhabited and unevacuated area, some buildings on the map may contain civilian non-combatants. This means that I have some rules of engagement to deal with. Specifically, to quote the briefing, I am not to target or destroy buildings unless I receive hostile fire and positively ID enemy units within the structures. In other words, having arrived with a sledgehammer, I require a scalpel. This is not a bit of flavour text added into the mission briefing. I will lose 150 points out of the total 850 if enough collateral damage accumulates. I get the bulk of my points for destroying the enemy, a specific 300 points for the Shilka AA vehicles, another 300 for destroying Syrian forces in general, and then a 50 point bonus if I get the enemy casualties down to 80% or below. The enemy are most likely to be in the 4 hamlets and the farms, and the easiest way to maximise their casualties would simply be to start shooting up all the buildings, which I can't do because of the rules of engagement. Another option would be to move up in overwhelming force and clear all the compounds and buildings with infantry, but my final objective is to keep my own force above 90% strength for future operations. Moving up and trying to clear buildings is pretty much the best way for me to get my pixel tripping killed. It gives the Syrians the best chance they have to inflict heavy casualties. So we have a bit of a problem here. I have to deal with a series of hamlets where I need to kill a lot of Syrians while causing as little collateral damage as possible and taking as few casualties as possible. This kind of conundrum is one of the ways that scenarios in Combat Mission Shock Force 2 are balanced. The Syrians have no chance in a stand-up fight, so the US and NATO forces need to have their options restricted to compensate. This is what keeps it interesting. So how am I going to deal with this? Looking at the ground, I'm expecting the bulk of the enemy force to set up in hamlets A, B and C. This area contains the densest concentration of buildings, the most vegetation, and there are several water obstacles in there to boot. This is the best defensive terrain, and it gives the Syrians the best opportunities to engage my forces at close range, where their lack of training and heavy weapons is going to be a lot less of a disadvantage. The terrain on the left is a lot more open. There's some cover in the orchards and there's some scattered farms, but it seems much less likely to be full of enemy pixel tripping, and if they are set up there, I'm going to be able to exploit my advantages in range and firepower to destroy them with a lower risk of collateral damage. I'm doing a bit of maneuver warfare thinking. I've looked at the battlefield and made a judgment on where I'm going to encounter resistance and where I'm not. I split the ground into surfaces and gaps. On my right, I have a surface. This is where the enemy is, this is where my progress will be slow, and where I'm going to be engaged in a frontal head-to-head confrontation. On my left, I have a gap. I don't think the enemy will be here. I'm going to be able to move at speed, and best of all, I'm going to be flanking the likely enemy positions on the other flank. As I push around the left flank, I'm going to be opening up new angles to observe and fire into the hamlets. If I push all the way around to the back, I can create a fire support position halfway up the flank on this small hill before occupying the ridgeline on the rear map border. This kind of movement is going to draw enemy fire, but I'm counting on it being ineffective because of the range involved, and actually to my advantage. If the enemy is shooting at me, I'm more likely to get a positive ID and be able to engage under the rules of engagement. Once I've gotten around the left flank as far as I can, the Syrians are going to be caught in an L shape and exposed to fire from several angles at once. Then I can start carefully and methodically moving up from whichever direction seems safest in order to close with and destroy the remaining enemy. I'd rather not have to get to that stage, but if I have no choice other than to bring infantry up and clear the hamlets, this is going to be the best way to do it. I've got to make this flanking manoeuvre first though, and as the game kicks off, I'm moving 2 infantry sections up through this orchard to occupy the little farm covering the crossing points on the left. I can use the farm to get some observation fire onto Hamlet D and any enemy forces that might contest the bridge. My other infantry platoon is hanging around at the back as reserve, and my advancing infantry is supported by their LAVs, the tank platoon and my recce units. And it's a good job too, because not only am I getting a lot of first turn spots on enemy pixel truppen, but there are Syrian anti-tank assets at the back of the map that immediately start to engage. These are wire-guided AT-3B saggers, which were originally produced in the 1960s and use a manual command line of sight or MACLOS guidance system. Under this system, the operator has to use a small joystick to fly the missile into the target. Not only is this quite difficult and requires significant and frequent training to maintain an effective level of accuracy, but it also means that the operator has to remain exposed to enemy fire as he guides the missile, which can be very unhealthy due to the missile's very noticeable launch signature. The first sagger, firing from the ridge running along the back of the map, immediately plows into the ground. They were aiming at one of the LAVs approaching the farm. The sagger might be old, but the warhead is easily enough to destroy a lightly armoured LAV, and the launch is quickly spotted and the missile team taken out by cannon fire. The second sagger team fares a little better, firing from Hill 135 in the back right of the map. Their missile only just misses one of the Coyote recce LAVs, and their position is slightly harder to land hits on because of the angle of incoming fire. But in the end it's exposed on the open hilltop, and it's only a matter of time until it gets taken out. The Syrians also have some SPG-9 recoilless rifles at the back, which also suffer from significant backblast and therefore also have pretty much one chance at getting a hit in before my fire support spots and destroys them. Both of the SPG-9s on the left, one on the hill a bit further on from the sagger team, but the other is set up on the tallest roof of the compound near the map edge, and the building therein immediately receives some collateral damage. This is okay according to the rules of engagement. I've positively ID'd a target, but I'm still causing damage to the civilian buildings and might be shaving a few points off my score. That's better than losing a vehicle or any troops, but again, there are costs and benefits to my actions here that have been introduced to balance out NATO's technical and material superiority over the Syrians. By now, my left-hand platoon has gotten 2 sections into the farm overlooking the bridge, and they're starting to engage enemy infantry around Hamlet D. The Canadian infantry sections have a pretty standard Western style layout. 2 teams of 4, a light machine gun and an underbarrel grenade launcher in each team. Everybody has optical sights, fairly standard stuff. One slight difference is that the LAVs carry the SRAAWM, or the Short Range Anti-Armour Weapon Medium, which is the Canadian designation for the Swedish Carl Gustaf recoilless rifle. This is an 84mm weapon with a few different types of ammunition, and it gives the Canadian infantry sections a bit more long-range anti-armour and anti-infantry capability when they're outside of their LAVs. The LAVs themselves are pretty similar to the US Strikers in terms of speed and armour. In other words, lots of speed, not a lot of armour. with the important distinction that they bring the 25mm Bushmaster cannon to the party. This is an excellent, accurate, rapid-fire weapon capable of wrecking enemy infantry and light vehicles. In fact, a clear demonstration of how effective the Bushmaster is comes as I suffer my first casualties in 2 separate incidents. Both are friendly fire accidents involving 25mm cannon rounds from the LAVs hitting trees near my infantry. There's not much I can do about these except to try and be a bit more careful with the LAV's fire arcs. Realistically though, these are minor problems, and the enemy infantry out in the open at Hamlet D, infantry who could potentially interfere with my forces when I cross the bridge, are quickly wiped out or driven away by the Canadian infantry, their LAVs and the Leopards. The Leopard in question is the odd one out in the platoon. The other 3 tanks are Leopard 2A6Ms, equipped with 120mm guns and slat armour and modernised optics. This one is a Leopard C2, which is a slightly older version, less modern optics and subsystems, and with a slightly lower calibre 105mm gun. Given that the tanks are mostly going to be engaged in anti-infantry work against an enemy with less than effective anti-tank weapons, this isn't a big deal. The tanks are starting to get engaged in some anti-vehicle work. I've spotted one of the Shilkas hiding behind a building on the right. It's got a bit of defilade going for it and plenty of trees that provide a degree of cover and concealment. As an AA vehicle, it's got an impressive armament of quad 23mm cannons and some pretty good optics. I don't really need to worry too much about the cannons with the Leopards, though external subsystems are likely to get stripped away, but the LAVs are very vulnerable to the 23mm shells, as demonstrated by one of the Recce Coyotes, which catches a bit of the burst from the Shilka. It's only a single hit, but it's enough to cause a casualty in the turret, bringing me up to a total of 4 so far. It's easy enough to enact some revenge though. On the next turn, as the Coyote reverses off to find a different position, 2 of the Leopards move up to where they can get eyes on the offending Shilka and put a couple of 120mm Sabo rounds through the front, knocking it out. My infantry at the farm have spotted a second Shilka, again in defilade over on the right flank, and having conveniently moved a 3rd Leopard up to support the infantry there, it's easy enough for them to pass the spot onto the tank, which then destroys the Shilka. Not only is this a nice confirmation of the theory that pushing around the left flank will open up new angles and reveal new targets, but according to my guesswork, that leaves just the single Shilka still standing. It feels like I've cleared enough space around the bridge to think about making the crossing. This is obviously risky, even with a surplus of fire support, so I want to do it as staffily as possible. Not only is the bridge a natural choke point and a prime location to be covered by as yet unseen AT assets, mines or even IEDs, the force that crosses is going to be on its own in a new space and could potentially end up taking fire from enemy positions that my fire support doesn't have a line of sight to. To avoid this kind of problem, I want to push my force away from the bridge as fast as possible after they get across in order to extend the range and degrade the effects of any incoming small arms. To screen off the crossing point itself, I can drop some smoke rounds from my 155 batteries and keep this smoke screen topped up by using the smoke launchers on my vehicles as they cross. There's a big field on the left edge of the map that is somewhat obscured from potential Syrian positions by the orchard and the ground, and it seems likely to be clear because I've had eyes on it from the farm for some time now and I haven't seen any sign of anything. To be sure, and to check if part of the route I'm intending to take is covered or mined, I run one of the Coyotes across the front of my position at the farm, past the bridge and then into a hull down position next to the irrigation ditch, where it should present a juicy tempting target to any Syrians hiding in the field. Nothing happens, so that route is probably safe. The Syrians are giving me some incentive to push out from my position at the farm. There have been a few random mortar bombs dropping in for a while now, probably spotting rounds that an observer somewhere is trying to walk onto the target he wants to smack about, so I'm conveniently moving the infantry there back into the LAVs to grab some cover at about the same time as the 155 smoke shells come in. Up first is one of the Leopards. This is a risk-reward decision that definitely has a lot of weight to both sides. On the one hand, the first vehicle across is going to be the one that finds out about any mines or IEDs, and losing the Leopard would mean losing a whole quarter of my tank force. On the other hand, the Leopard is my most capable, best protected single unit, so if anything does go wrong, not only is it the one best able to survive and defend itself, but if it gets through into position in the field, I'll have a significant amount of fire support set up to cover the transit of the other vehicles. The Leopard gets across with no problems. It even manages to spot some Syrian soldiers in a house through the smoke and gives them a burst from the coax as it runs over a stretch of fence. Something that the Leopard is again better at doing than the LAVs. And then as it speeds away to the left, it even spots the final shulker. This is set up behind a building in Hamlet D and is conveniently facing the wrong way to cover the bridge. It is, however, facing off to the right flank, and the positioning of the other three shulkers reinforces my belief that pushing the left is the best option. If I pushed up on the right flank, my troops would have been caught in a crossfire between the three defiladed shulkers in a way that would likely have resulted in heavy casualties. So despite the left-hand push having some drawbacks, like having to cross the bridge, it doesn't involve wandering into the kill zone of three rapid-firing quad 23mm cannons. The rest of my force manages to get across in safety, though as the smoke begins to disperse, one of the LAVs is targeted by a Syrian soldier with an RPG. It flies high, which is good because LAVs are lightly armoured enough to be very vulnerable to pretty much everything except small arms, and I have two LAVs, their infantry sections, the Leopard and the Coyote on the other bank, in position to shut the RPG gunner down in short order. He is, however, in a building, and there is definitely some collateral damage going on here. Assuming that the residents of this house have survived the incoming fire, they're probably going to be complaining to the next journalists who come through about how life was better back when their house had all its walls. I have made a couple of mistakes here, which rapidly become obvious. As I get the entire LAV platoon into the field to debust their infantry and spread out, one of them gets spotted by the shulker. This is pretty much simple carelessness. I've mistakenly parked up an LAV in full view of the enemy, and though I was hoping that the Leopard would have spotted the AA vehicle by now, it hasn't because it's sitting in ever so slightly the wrong position. Luckily, when the burst of 23mm fire comes in and turns the back of the LAV into a colander, the infantry have already gone out and away. The LAV is a total write-off, but only the gunner was killed, and on the next turn I can slot the second Leopard onto a line between the dead LAV and the shulker's position where I know the Leopard will have a high chance of making the spot. It doesn't disappoint, and that's the third shulker out of the picture. I made the second mistake earlier, and though I've gotten away with it, I only picked it up as the panicking driver of the destroyed LAV runs straight across the irrigation canal. I had thought that this was impassable to infantry as well as vehicles, but obviously not, and it would have been considerably less risky for the infantry to cross the ditch down here, covered by the Coyote, and be rejoined by their LAVs in the field, than it was to run them across the bridge crammed into the back of the vehicles where a single RPG could have cooked them all in one go. Just because it didn't turn out badly doesn't mean it wasn't a mistake, and it's a result of the gap in my terrain analysis. There are still pros and cons to both choices, of course, and legit arguments for crossing at the bridge using the LAVs, based mostly around speed and reducing the threat of enemy mortars. But the problem is that I didn't see the alternative option and evaluate the choices that were open to me. Speaking of enemy mortars, spotting rounds very quickly start falling in the field that I've just occupied, and it doesn't take long for them to develop into a proper barrage that sends my infantry scurrying for the relative safety of either their LAVs or out of the field onto the flanks of the nearby hill. Some of my troops are wounded by mortar fragments here, but they're not incapacitated, and they're able to carry on either because the wounds are minor enough to be ignored or have been mitigated by their body armour. It takes a little while for me to consolidate on the left-hand hill. I don't want to run into Syrian infantry in a close-range reverse slope position on the other side, but all the while I'm shooting up any enemy troops that show themselves. I'm strenuously avoiding the use of area fire in order to minimise the collateral damage. If it weren't for the ROE, I'd probably have levelled half the buildings on the map by now using artillery. But even when the LAVs and Leopards are engaging positively ID'd targets on their own initiative, they're still putting a significant amount of fire out. But the choice between sitting still and taking enemy fire or accepting the likelihood of collateral damage isn't really a choice at all. It's more like the automatic imposition of a minor urban remodeling project. After the very persistent mortars have shifted onto the top of the left-hand hill and killed another of my pixel shrubmen as they try to board an LAV, I reckon it's time to give the enemy someone else to shoot at. These mortars have pretty much followed my flanking manoeuvre from the farm, to the bridge, to the field, and now to the hill, and while I keep thinking they're going to run out of ammo, they're not showing any signs whatsoever of slackening off. This is by far the most significant threat to my troops so far, apart from friendly fire, so I move a second LAV platoon up on the centre right to try and soak up some attention. Moving up here is pretty standard stuff. Almost everybody is on Overwatch, while a few teams cross the ditch in front, followed by a slow but steady movement forward that's never intended to close the range too much, but nevertheless uncovers more enemy positions to be engaged by the LAVs and Leopards while bringing down mortar fire. But having to adjust the fire to the right hand side of the map has presumably thrown the enemy observers off their game a little bit, and neither spotting rounds nor barrages come close enough to worry me for the rest of the game. This frees up the left hand push to move on, and leaving a small force to back up a Leopard on the hill where it can cover that angle off, my infantry moves off through the orchards, LAVs leapfrogging each other and infantry disembarking at any point that contact with the enemy seems likely. Farm X is occupied without any resistance, opening up another observation position for part of the platoon to occupy, while the other half zeroes in on the compound at the back of the map. This is where one of the enemy recoilless rifles engaged from earlier on, and being a substantial elevated position where I'm going to be able to see into the rear of the enemy's right flank, it's a location I want to get myself set up in. But it also means clearing a compound which may or may not have enemy troops inside, so I'm slowly moving in on it and waiting until my pioneer reinforcements arrive so I can make my own doors. But before my pioneers show up, the enemy gets a batch of reinforcements. A whole mob of uncon fighters pops into existence on the map edge around this drainage ditch. Obviously this is a fairly reasonable covered route that they could use to get down to hamlets A, B and C to reinforce the Syrian soldiers there. Unfortunately for them, not only do fighters not benefit from the effects of civilian density like combatant type uncons do, in other words they're going to struggle to blend in with the local farmers when they're dressed like that, but they're immediately spotted by the forces I've got on the left flank. The LAVs and Leopards get stuck in to devastating effect, and the deal is sealed by the FO, who's been tagging along behind the left flank for some time, calling in a mission from the 155s. With that violent interlude over and done with, it's time to focus on securing that compound. My pioneer platoon reinforcements have finally arrived, and I detach a squad and bring it up along the same path my forces on the left took, while my pixel trippin continue to smack around any enemy contacts that are foolish enough to expose themselves. My plan for storming the compound is to avoid the entrance, blast my way inside, and then get plenty of bodies in there to make sure I can overwhelm any Syrian resistance. If it weren't for the ROE, I'd have been preparing the place with cannon and MG fire for the last 5-10 minutes, but a bit of explosive entry with plenty of backup should probably do the trick. Getting in goes pretty smoothly, but the survivors of the recoilless rifle team on the roof kill a pair of pioneers before they go down. This is exactly why I've been wanting to avoid any kind of close quarters battle. Casualties are highly likely. I'm willing to risk it with this compound because it felt unlikely to have any significant enemy force in it. And it didn't. Those two recoilless rifleman crew were the only enemy in there, but they both traded 1 for 1, which is not what I want. With the entire left flank secure and the remaining enemy forces stuck in an L shape of Canadian fire support positions, it's time to start working on them. Storming the compound has not increased my optimism about clearing those hamlets with infantry, so I take the decision to ratchet things up a notch and bring the artillery to bear. This is pretty much an exercise in choosing to try and minimise my casualties at the expense of breaching the rules of engagement, but I am trying to cause as little collateral damage as possible by using airbursting anti-personnel artillery. I have plenty of time, we're only about halfway through, but after pounding the hamlets for a while and not getting any response from the Syrians, I gamble on a ceasefire. The end result is a major victory for the Canadians. I've lost 4 men killed and 4 wounded, along with a single LAV. The Syrians have lost 94 dead, 38 wounded and the 3 shilkers. In terms of the actual objectives, I've got 493 points for destroying the shilkers and their infantry support, with 50 extra points for keeping my force above 90% strength, and 75 out of 150 for preserving civilian buildings. That's a total of 618, compared to the 42 points the Syrians have for inflicting casualties on me. That's it for this video, a quick look at the Canadian Army in Shock Force 2. I've still got videos to do for the Germans, Dutch, Syrian Army and the unconventional, so there's those to look forward to. Hope you all enjoyed this guys, and I'll catch you in the next video.